In this video, I'm going to show you how to thrift flip an old cardigan into a bolero or a shrug. I've been seeing a lot of this look and I feel like it's great for layering for the fall. You're going to need thread, measuring tape, pins, scissors, a cardigan, and optional buttons. I started by placing it on my mannequin and cutting roughly the new length for the shrug. I used a measuring tape to make sure that the cuts were symmetrical on either side of the cardigan. The main thing for this part is that you're not cutting it too short because you can obviously always cut it shorter later. I'm now going to take the piece that we just cut, the bottom piece, and we're going to cut a thinner strip, making sure that we're keeping the finished edge from the bottom. As you can see, because this is a knit fabric, the fabric was going to fray, so we're going to attach the strip that we just cut onto the bottom of our cardigan, keeping in mind that this will also add a little length to the shrug. Now putting the cardigan on inside out, I'm going to place pins to make it a little tighter on the arms and the sides. Then I'm going to take it off and make sure that the pins I just placed are lying flat and evenly throughout the sleeve and the side. Then, using my measuring tape to make sure I'm taking in the same amount, I'm going to place pins on the other side seam and sleeve. Because this is a knit, I'm going to use a zigzag stitch for all of my stitches. I'm then just going to sew along where I place my pins. I can then cut away all the excess fabric. Now placing the cardigan right side out, I'm going to try it on again for fit. As you can see, I wanted it a little shorter in the front, so I'm placing pins to mark the new length. Keeping in mind it's going to be slightly longer because of the ribbing piece we're going to attach. I can now cut along where I place my pins, and as you can see, because I'm not taking any fabric away from the back, I'm creating a slight curve in the front of the top. As I'm continuing to make these adjustments, I'm making sure that my edges are as straight as possible. We're now ready to attach our ribbing. I'm going to start by cutting it a little thinner, but it's totally up to you how thick or thin you want this piece to be. I'm then going to place a pin where I'm going to eventually add an extra button, just so I can get a better idea of what the sweater is going to look like. And then I'm going to attach my ribbing right sides together onto the sweater. So again, placing right sides together, I'm going to pin it along the bottom of the sweater. If your ribbing is longer than the new bottom of your cardigan, you may need to take it in a bit. I like to do this at the side seams, so I make sure that my side seams are lining up. So I'm just going to place a pin where I'm going to be taking it in. This step also might not be applicable depending on your cardigan. And then I'm just going to continue pinning the right sides together of my ribbing and my cardigan. With the ribbing all pinned on, I decided I wanted it even thinner, so I repinned it. This is really just a trial and error until you get it to what you want it to look like. And then I'm ready to sew along where I pinned. And again, making sure that my side seams are still lining up, and I'm going to start by sewing that bit. So I'm just taking in my ribbing about an inch on either side, but it'll be different for every sweater. And then I can trim away that extra fabric. And before attaching the ribbing, I folded my sweater in half and just trimmed away any of the excess to make sure that the two sides were symmetrical. And then I repinned my ribbing, and now I'm ready to sew it with a zigzag stitch. Again, making sure that it's right sides together. You can now trim away the extra fabric. You do want to make sure that when you're trimming the fabric, you're leaving enough seam allowance that you can pin it from the other side. This will help with the top stitch that we're going to do in a later step. If you find that your fabric is at all fraying, you can do a second zigzag stitch to lock in those threads. Mine was, so I went over all my raw edges with a zigzag stitch. You could also use a serger if you had one. I'm now ready to pin my fabric for my top stitch. So I'm going to pin my seam allowance from my ribbing facing up, and this will help lock in the positioning of the ribbing. I then removed my buttons because I'll be changing those later and I didn't want them getting in the way of my top stitch. So you're now ready to sew along where you placed your pins, this time using a straight stitch. As you can see, I sewed mine quite close to the seam, and I caught my seam allowance on the other side of the fabric. It's now time to change my buttons. A button can really change the look of a garment, so I always like to lay them all out before I make my choice. I then use a measuring tape so I can evenly mark with pins where I'm going to place my buttons. And then with a hand sewing needle, I'm going to sew them all on. I always loop the thread around to strengthen the threads that are going to be taking on a lot of the tension. The last step is to add an extra buttonhole, so I'm going to place pins where I'm going to sew that. I'm placing the pin slightly smaller than the button because this is a knit and the fabric will stretch. So using my machine, I'm going to sew my buttonhole and then trim away the opening. And you're all done! Thank you for watching, and if you liked the video, please subscribe.